Rejoice and be glad, for today the Lord has made. November 30th. We're picking up on The Apostle, A Life of Paul by John Pollock. And we're on chapter 1 from The Land of Black Tents. And we begin. The judges leap from their places in fury. The hall of polished stones, scene of grave debates and historic trials, reverberated to the baying of a lynch crowd that rushed at a young defendant and manhandled him down the steps into the strong sunlight of the courts of the priests. Across this wide open space, down more steps, through court after court, Stephen was swept by judges, bystanders, worshippers, traders, until they had him out of the sacred temple precincts and into the streets of the holy city. This is the stoning of Stephen. This is him giving that last testimony. Wow, that was awesome, Mr. Pollock, of how Stephen was treated by the priests, rejecting Stephen. They are rejecting Jesus Christ. No sentence of death had been passed, nor could be executed unless confirmed by the Roman authorities after a solemn trial, solemn ritual to ensure justice to the last. But judges and mob cared nothing for that. When the northern gate wall was behind them, and they reached the rock of execution, twice the height of a man, they should have solemnly stripped him and thrown him cleanly over to break his neck, or at least to stun him, so that death by stoning would not be too unmerciful. But they did not. Instead, they pushed Stephen down as he was tangled, as his tangled clothes breaking the fall, and he staggered to his feet, fully conscious. The mob was shocked into reverting to forms of law in the judicial stoning. The first stones must be aimed by those who brought the charges. These witnesses therefore elbowed their way to the front, threw off their outer garments, and looked around for someone to guard them. A young lawyer, panting from the race through the streets, stepped forward. They recognized the Pharisee from Cilicia in Asia Minor, known as Saul among the Jews, and Paul among the Greeks and Romans. Paul watched approvingly as each witness picked up a heavy, jagged stone, raised it above his head, and threw it to gash and maim the man below. Then Paul heard Stephen's voice, pained but clear. He spoke as if no one, invisible yet close. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Stones showered as the mob scrambled to complete what the witnesses had begun. Stephen mastered his pain while blood gushed from his cuts and bruises. He knelt down in an attitude of prayer. Paul could not miss the words that came with surprising volume for a dying man. Lord, do not hold this sin against them. See, Stephen, like Jesus, was saying, forgive them, Lord. They know not what they do. The next stone knocked Stephen flat. He lost consciousness. The mob continued stoning until the body became obscene. Paul was born in a city between the mountain and the sea. The year was probably AD 1. But all early details are shadowy except his clear claim, I am a Jew of Tarsus, a citizen of no mean city, of the people of Israel, and of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. Tarsus was the principal city of the lush plain of Cilicia in the southern west corner of Asia Minor. The sea laid out of sight a dozen miles south. The Tarsus mountains curved in a great arc some 25 miles inland, coming nearly to the sea on the west and marked to the north by gorges and cliffs that stood like rock fortresses before the snows. A magnificent background for childhood, especially in winter, when the snow showed smooth on cloudless peaks. The river Cydnus, narrow and swift and usually brilliantly clear, ran through the city. It flowed into artificial harbor, an engineering masterpiece of the ancient world where Cleopatra had stepped ashore some 40 years before. Paul's birth to meet Antony, while all Taurus marveled at silver oars, a poop deck of beaten gold and purple sails, so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. Here each spring, when navigation resumed and the mountains passed thawed, slaves unloaded goods of the Orient. The city grew full of noise, smell, and prosperous bustle. Caravans set off due north up the Roman road and crossed the mountains by the Cilician gates, a crevice that had been chiseled wide enough for a wagon, another feat of ancient Tarsian engineering. Tarsus was a fusion of civilization at peace, under the rule of Rome. Indigenous Cilicians, Hittites, whose ancestors had once ruled Asia Minor, light-skinned Greeks, Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, who had come with Alexander the Great on his march to India. After the carve-up of Alexander's empire, when Tarsus became part of the kingdom of the Seleucids, who ruled from Syria, King Antiochus IV settled a colony of Jews about 170 BC. They had rights and privileges, and a determination never to marry into those outside their faith and blood, whom collectively they called Gentiles, meaning nations or Greeks outside of House of Israel. Paul's ancestry probably were among them. They may have sprung from an obscure town called Gishhala in Galilee. His father most likely was a master tent maker whose craftsmanship worked in leather and in silicium, a cloth woven from the hair of the large-haired black goats that gazed, as they still do, on the slopes of the Taurus, the black tents of Tarsus. On the slopes of the Tarsus. The black tents of Tarsus were used by caravans, nomads, and armies all over Asia Minor and Syria. Of Paul's mother nothing is known. He never mentions her. Perhaps she died in his infancy or became alienated in some way. But he may have simply had no particular occasion to do so. He had at least one sister. His father must have been a citizen of Burgess of Tarsus and obviously wealthy, for in a reform 15 years earlier, the rank of citizen had been removed from all householders without considerable fortune of property. Moreover, the family held the covenant title of citizens of Rome. Wow, that's where he gets his, he's a Roman. They had to go all the way to Rome. At that period, the civis Romans was seldom granted except for services rendered or for a fat fee. Maybe his dad paid for it. Whether Paul's grandfather aided Pompey or Cicero when Rome first governed Cilicia, or whether his father paid money, the Roman citizenship conferred local distinction and hereditary privileges which each member could claim whenever he traveled throughout the empire that Roman citizenship was also meant that Paul had a full Latin name, which would have been threefold, like Gallus Julius Caesar. The first two names were common to all the family. In Caesar's case, Gaius Julius, but in Paul's case, these are lost because his Greek colleague first wrote his life story and no Greek could understand Latin name. That makes sense. The third and personal was Paulus. Cogman. The third and personal Cogman was Paulus. He was given also a Jewish name with the rite of circumcision on the 8th day after birth, Saul. So on the 8th day he was called Saul, chosen either for its meaning, asked for, or in honor of the most famous Benjamite in history, King Saul. Saul was the name used at the home and emphasized that the Jewish inheritance meant the most in early years. Gentiles were all around, and the columns of pagan temples dominated the marketplace. Nineveh of the Assyrians, Babylon, Athens, and Rome had combined to create Tarsus, and Paul was unconsciously the child of his Orient Hellenic world. In his youth it seemed remote, for although many Jews throughout the Mediterranean had influenced by the Greek view of life, Paul's parents were Pharisees, members of the party most fervent in Jewish nationalism and strict in obedience to the law of Moses. They sought to guard their offspring against contamination. While friendship with Gentile children were discouraged. Greek ideas were despised. Though Paul from infancy could speak Greek, the lingua franca, and had working knowledge of Latin, his father at home spoke Aramaic, a derivative of Hebrew, the language of Judah. They looked to Jerusalem as Islam looks to Mecca. Their privilege as freemen of Tarsus and Roman citizens were nothing to the high honor of being Israelites, the people of promise, to whom alone the living God had revealed his glory and his plans. The school attached at the Tarsus synagogue taught nothing but the Hebrew text of the sacred law. Each boy repeated its phrases in chorus after the Hazan, or synagogue keeper, until vowels, accent, and rhythm were precisely correct. Paul learned to write the Hebrew characters accurately on the papyrus, thus gradually forming his own rolls of the scriptures. His father would have presented him with another set of scrolls on vellum, the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, from which the set readings were taken in synagogues on each Sabbath. By his 13th birthday, Paul had mastered Jewish history, the poetry of the Psalms, and the majestic literature of the prophets. His ear had been trained to the very pitch and accuracy, and a swift brain like his could retain what he heard as instantly and faithfully as a modern photographic mind retains a printed page. He was ready for higher education. Tarsus had its own university, famous for local students, such as Athenodorus, the tutor and confidant of the Emperor Augustus, and the equally eminent Nestor, both of whom had returned in old age to be the most distinguished citizens in Paul's boyhood. But a strict Pharisee would not embroil his son in pagan moral philosophy, such as studies would have to come later. So probably in the year that Augustine died, about 14 AD, the adolescent Paul was sent by sea to Palestine and climbed the hills to Jerusalem. During the next 5 or 6 years, he sat at the front, at the feet of Gamaliel, grandson of Hillel, the supreme teacher who a few years earlier had died at the age of more than 100. Under the fragile, gentle Gamaliel, a contrast which the leaders of the rival school of Shammai, Paul learned to dissect a text until scores of possible meanings were disclosed according to the considered opinion of generations of rabbis. Sorry, I'm fighting a cold. They had obscured the original sense by layers of tradition to protect an Israelite from the least possible infringement of the law and illogically to help him avoid inconveniences. Paul learned to debate in the question and answer style known to the ancient world as diatribe, and to expand, for a rabbi was not only part preacher but also part lawyer. Wow, that's interesting. That explains the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Ready to prosecute or defend those accused of breaking the sacred law. Paul outstripped his contemporaries. He had a powerful mind which could have led to a seat on the Sanhedrin in the hall of the polished stone. It made him a ruler of the Jews. The state was a theocracy in which religious and national leaders were identical, so that the 71 members of the Sanhedrin were equally judges, senators, and spiritual masters. The court was supreme in all religious decisions, and in what little self-government the Romans allowed, some of its members were drawn from the hierarchy of the priesthood, others were lawyers and rabbis. Before Paul could hope to be a master in Israel, he had to master a trade. For every Jew was bred to a trade, and in theory no rabbis took fees, but rather supported himself. Paul therefore left Jerusalem in his early 20s. Had he been there during the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, he would surely mention having argued against him like other Pharisees did. In later years he spoke often of the death of Jesus by crucifixion, but never as an eyewitness. Paul probably returned to Tarsus to work in the family tent-making business and resumed the old routine, winter and spring in Tarsus, until plain grew steamy and malaria then summered city in the Tarsus foothills. Winter or summer he would have taught in synagogue. A hint in one of the letters suggests he was strongly missionary-minded. Whenever Jews worshipped, Gentile sympathizers were admired as God-fearers. Pharisees like Paul urged God-fearers to become proselytes, full Jews. Okay. To submit to the simple but powerful rite of circumcision, and therefore to honor the ceremonial and personal demands of the law in all its rigor. The burden might be heavy, but the reward would be great, as they earned the favor of God. Paul's father could take full and justified delight in his son who had followed in his steps as a Pharisee, and had the intellectual force to reach the highest office in Israel. Soon after his 18th birthday, Paul returned to Jerusalem, with or without a wife. He almost certainly had been married. Jews rarely remain celibate, and parenthood was a qualification required of candidates for the Sanhedrin. His Paul's wife is never mentioned in his writings. He may have suffered bereavement, losing not only his wife but an only child. For in later years, though he seemed impatient with women as a sex, he displayed gentleness toward individuals and an understanding of marriage, which belie his being a misorganist, or misogynist. Wow. And virtually adopted the young man, Timothy, as to replace a son. More likely his wife and family returned with Paul in Jerusalem. They could discharge the laws more completely and praiseworthy obligation and display zeal where it would be noticed. In other words, sounding the so far to be seen. There Paul could also combat the movement launched by Jesus of Nazareth. Tarsus must have heard echoes of the teaching and claims of the new prophet, and strange reports of miracles, even the tale that he had risen from the dead. And there we have chapter 1. And we'll stop right there, trying to go chapter by chapter. Amen? Maranatha.